times that I should know that. And I see Kevin standing in the back, and it didn't even clue me in that I need to push the button. So welcome, everyone. So I've been working as a contractor for the past 20 years. Did you know that? And I call it a hit and run business. And what I mean by that is I go into a project for some short period of time, maybe a 6-month thing or an 8-month thing, and you kind of go in, get your stuff done and leave. I call that a hit and run. Then you go to the next customer and you go and you hit and run. And you might have 2 or 3 of those things going on at one time, and I did that for 20 years. And before contracting, I was an employee in departments working with teams for about 10 years before that. Then what started to happen about 4 years ago, I started to be unhappy in my job. The hit and run thing, I was never digging in, I was leaving projects, never saw how they impacted users at the end of the day, never involved in the long-term maintenance part of the projects, which could be interesting. And what happens as a contractor, if you get out of that mode, you lose that understanding. You don't know what it's like anymore to build something and live with the decisions you've made. Because as a contractor, you're on to the next thing. So you don't understand the ramifications of all that. So I decided to change the way I was doing things, and I started to look for a full-time job or a full-time contract, something that I could fire all my clients, stop with doing 100 things a day, and focus really on one thing at a time. And I found that in the government. I was lucky enough to get a job almost 3 years ago, or about 3 years ago, with the ATF, working for the Department of Justice. So I've been working on ATF.gov, which is a Drupal 7 project for the past 3 years. And I work with a really super fantastic team. And while I was bringing some Drupal expertise to that project and that team, I actually learned a lot more from that team than I was giving them. And part of the things I've learned is what this presentation is about. And my name is Stephen Cross. I have a podcast, Talking Drupal. If you ever want to, thank you. If you ever want to listen to 3 guys just chat about Drupal-y things every week, you can tune us in. I also run a Drupal camp, much smaller than this one, but just as good, in New England, and that's at the end of November. You can go to nedcamp.org, check that out. We just opened up session submissions yesterday morning. The slides for this presentation are on the GovCon website, and they're also at stephencross.com. So there's some interesting things that happened in our world, in the Drupal world, in the web dev world over the last 4 or 5 years. It's been the advent of these modern workflows. So we now have local development environments that are containerized in virtual machines. We use these tools to do builds for us, some automation, continuous integration, continuous deployment processes. And during all this time, when someone gives you the pitch about what the value of these workflows, one thing they always say is at the end is automated testing. And automated testing and all of these workflows here, automation, the word automation, it means something. It means I'm going to take something that I maybe have done manually and it's a repetitive process, and now I'm going to automate it. So the reasons you automate things is for increased quality, take less time. Is everyone using modern workflows? I'm just curious. Has everyone kind of integrated these things into their lives, continuous integration, things like that, getting the benefits from it? The idea of the automation, the machine's going to do the work for you, and it's a repetitive process. These have been great for us. Except for one thing, is that this is a list of things that are good for us, and they're hard to do, like eating healthy, daily journaling, going to church on a weekly basis. These are for me, by the way, things that I struggle with, and automated testing. So these are all things here that we all know are good for us, but they're hard to do. And they're hard to do in a quality way, in a meaningful way. So if you decide to eat healthy, but you're only going to do it 1 day a week, that's good, but it's probably not ideal for you, right? You really should be eating healthy all the time to get the benefits from it. Same thing with daily journaling. I mean, if anyone daily journals, you see that there's benefits for it, but that is hard to do every day. These are just like some of these things are just New Year's resolutions. Automated testing is very much like that, in that it's hard to do. It's hard to stick with, it's hard to get started. And some of the tips I'm going to give you today is going to be a way, if you desire to do automated testing in a meaningful way, that I think some of these tips today will help you out. Back to the eating healthy, I started trying to get healthier over the same sort of period of time, right? When I started to make these career changes and life changes. And that was me 5 years ago, on vacation. And over the past those years, I've started to lose weight, and I've gone up and down. I got to thank you for the thumbs up back there. When I first gave this particular talk about 1.5 years ago, the first time I did it, I was probably about 15 or 20 pounds lighter than I am now. So it's not perfect, right? I've done pretty good. You can look at that 5-year-old picture and see it. But there are ups and downs, just like there are in anything that you're trying to make changes for in your lifetime. One of the things that I learned when I started to try to be healthier is a quote from a guy, this guy named Mike Daggett. Online he's known as Fat Dag. He has this saying that he says, set attendance goals, not performance goals. What he means by that is if you want to introduce exercise into your life, the way to do it is not to go to the gym and work out for 3 hours every day in a week, because it will kill you, you will hate it, and you won't continue. So what his idea is that set attendance goals, that you will go to the gym 3 times a week and not put any performance goals around that. Not that you're going to work out for an hour, not that you're going to, just that you're going to get yourself there and do it. And that's what I did with exercise. I started walking. So instead of trying to walk 3 miles a day, I just decided to get out every day. Whether I only went a half a mile or 3 miles, the idea was to make it an attendance goal, not a performance goal. And I think that applies also to some of the things you're going to do with setting up automated testing. Effective automated testing begins with effective user acceptance testing. So that's where we're going to start today, is what is effective user acceptance testing. So user acceptance testing in our life cycle of projects is officially, I'm going to read a phrase of what it officially is. User acceptance testing is the last phase of a software testing process. During user acceptance testing, actual software users test the software to make sure it can handle the required tasks in the real world. That's what the official definition of user acceptance testing. And when we set up UAT, as I'll be calling it moving forward, you usually have some design documentation of things that you want to test, the functionality that you want to test. And then you have a set of people that, when the software is ready, they understand the functionality that you want to have, and they go through those documents, and they test what they're supposed to test, and they give feedback to the development team. And if it passes the test, that's great, the software moves out. If it doesn't pass a test, it goes back to the development team, and that cycle continues. If you haven't done user acceptance testing, if you're not doing it now, one thing is to keep it simple. And I'm going to show you how to keep it simple through what we've done at the ATF with user acceptance testing. And when I moved from that hit and run job 3 years ago into the ATF, this is one of the big things I learned from that team. Is I wasn't a very good user acceptance testing person. I didn't really believe in it all that much. And the hit and run projects that I was always on, I was never focused on, well, it's terrible to say it like this, but I wasn't really focused on the quality of the software that was going out. That's not true, but that wasn't the area that I focused in. So I was one of those people, when you're going to see the process that I'm going to describe to you, I was kicking and screaming and didn't adopt this too well. at the beginning. So what is it? I'm going to describe how we do user acceptance testing in a real meaningful way by showing you an example. So we have this on the atf.gov website. It's a public website. There is a section of the website that is private, and it's for newsletters called the Inside the ATF. So when an agent retires or is no longer with the agency, they lose access to the internal network, as you would expect, and no longer with the agency, but the agency still wants to communicate with them in some meaningful way, and they do that through a newsletter. A way to give them access to the newsletter but not let the whole world see it, not that it's top secret information, is to put it behind some secured section of the site, which is what we've done. So these newsletters come out monthly, and our implementation for doing this is pretty straightforward. We don't use Drupal user accounts for every single agent. We don't want to do that. So what we basically have is a single username and password that they all know, and it changes on a regular basis, and they get notified of that, and it's really like a speed bump. So if they come to this page, they have to put this username and password in, and then they could get access to the newsletter archive. So from a Drupal implementation perspective, it's basically like a listing page of newsletters. The content gets tagged as being inside ATF content. We use private documents in media modules in Drupal 7. Anyone ever have fun with media in Drupal 7? It's not fun. You're liars. And we use the protected pages module. That module is the thing that gives you that speed bump that you can say, take this page and put a secure login on it, and you kind of type in what you want the login to be. We did a little bit of hook code in there, and we built this functionality into the website. So, if I was going to put user acceptance testing around this new functionality that we built, what would that functionality look like? What would that testing look like? Well, there's a number of different people that need to test in this process to make sure the software is working. We have to have the content administrator do some user acceptance testing, and what are they going to test? Well, they need to test that they're going to be able to upload a PDF document successfully. They can mark it as private. They can set that category on that content to inside ATF, and then it can publish that node. So that's a piece they would need to test. So if I was to write a user acceptance testing script for this, it would look like this. And our script actually is this that was used for this user acceptance testing. So the steps that I just described, these are the steps we would want a content administrator to take. They're going to log in as a content administrator. They're going to go to the certain page on the website. They're going to upload the document, hit the next button, select a private, hit the next button, enter Apple in for the title. That's fake, obviously. Choose an organization is inside ATF. Then they're going to enter the description of the document and then hit save. Pretty straightforward steps, but they're documented for someone to actually go ahead and do that. I have someone else I have to test for. That would be the general public. So the general public is going to go, when we want a user acceptance test for them, what are they going to do? We need to validate that if they go to the URL for Inside ATF, that is not a public URL that's indexed, by the way. We need to validate that they cannot access that page or the documents inside of it. That script would look something like this, as you can imagine. This time you're going to go to the website, and the goal here is to verify that the Inside ATF document is not accessible, and these are the steps they take. Open incognito window, go to this URL, verify a password is required. Go to this document, a document we already have in the system, make sure it's not visible. These are the steps that a user would have to take to test this functionality. And there's one more person that needs to test in a user acceptance testing. Who is that? That's the agent that now is to verify that they can access the document. So they need to be able to get to the website. They need to log in with the username and password. They need to verify that they can see the listings. And they need to verify they can download one of the newsletter documents. That script looks like this. Pretty straightforward steps. Actually, anyone could follow these steps if I printed them out and handed them to them. They don't need any special knowledge or any special domain expertise or any special access, frankly, for some of these steps. So let's talk about our development cycle a little bit. This is a standard flow that everyone has when they do development. You start at 12 o'clock at the development circle there. And you develop some code. When it's time to release that code, you create a pull request. When you create a pull request, a developer looks at that code. At the ATF, we have more than one developer, which is great. So if I create a pull request, another developer will do the code review on it. So we have multiple people looking at this. So when the code review is done, if it passes the code review, that developer will merge the pull request. It will go off into the QA environment, and the UAT steps are done. If the UAT steps pass, then it goes on to merge into production. Great. If it doesn't pass, it goes back to the cycle again. Pretty common exercise for a development cycle. So let's talk about where the UAT exists in the cycle for our team at the ATF. And this is where I was kicking and screaming when I first joined the team. Is the UAT starts at the very beginning of the development cycle. So those scripts that you saw a few minutes ago when we implemented this inside the ATF, the UAT is written at the same time the code is written by the developer who wrote the code. Not a separate QA group, but the person who wrote the code is going to write the UAT. When that code is finished and goes to the pull request at, what's that, about 2 o'clock there, the pull request, the code review by the other developer is not just reviewing the code, it's also reviewing the UAT. So the developer 1 writes the UAT, developer 2 tests the UAT. So during the code review process, the developer looks through the code, gives comments back, code looks great. Then goes over to the UAT and actually runs the UAT steps. And this is where I struggled a lot, is my UAT steps were getting more feedback than my code steps were because I wasn't writing very good UAT at the time. That's a skill that I had to learn over time. So a code review, a pull request could get rejected, not because the code is bad, because the UAT is bad. Maybe it missed something. Maybe there was a nuance that the other developer thought about when they did the code review that wasn't in the UAT. Or maybe it's a section of the UAT that got just completely forgotten to be written. All those things are possible. So at this point during the process, for one small functionality change in the system, we've already had 2 developers looking at the code, writing the code, and thinking about the UAT and testing it. So eventually that code gets through the review process, goes to merge, and then now is at UAT. So those steps for the UAT that are going to be executed now by a real user are already been through 2 developers at least. So who tests? See, in that cycle that you just saw there, who tests the UAT? Everybody. And our team at the ATF, the developers are doing the testing and the content administrators do 90% of the formal UAT when it gets into the QA environment. Sometimes it could be an outside user that might do testing, but usually it's one of the content administrators. So the content administrators know the system pretty well. So by the time our code gets all the way around the clock from 12 to 12, that functionality is rolling out that door in a pretty good state. Now, are we perfect? No, certainly we miss things. Often the person doing the UAT, the content administrator doing the last UAT cycle will find things that the developers didn't think of, and that makes perfect sense, right? They're the ones dealing with the content. So we've had at least 3 people looking at this stuff for every change. So some of the benefits of doing UAT in this kind of way. One is that we're focusing on the end result at the very beginning. And I know developers always say that they do that, they're trying to focus on the end result, but unless you're actually writing the test steps, you're probably not completely focused on it. Because we uncover problems with the code by writing the UAT and testing it. So the focus on the end product really early in the development cycle. Another thing is there's ownership of the problems. So if developer 1 is working on an issue, it ends up not being just their issue, because developer 2 or developer 3 is going to be doing code review and UAT. So the ownership of that problem becomes much more broad in the organization. The cross-training value of this, of having these UAT steps manual like this, is pretty amazing. Is because everyone is learning all aspects of the system because they're doing code reviews and testing UAT. It's a great way to cross-train new people coming into the department. If there's an area of the system that they need to work on, you can actually go back to the UAT steps for that piece of functionality to, it's like self-documenting. They can actually see how something is supposed to work. And that has happened to us many times. When something's broken in the system, we'll go back to a ticket from a year earlier, and we could see that it passed the UAT steps at that point. So this is how it was supposed to work when it went in, and it did work because it was tested at least 3 times, and it's broken now. Why is that? And it helps us figure out problems with the coding as we move through the system and as time rolls on. It's a fantastic source of documentation. I'm going to show you how we document the UAT in a second. I think as a result of this, we have a much stronger team. Everyone is involved in all aspects of all features that are rolled out. So what we've built, I think, is a testing culture. It's built into the work we do every day. There is not a ticket that goes out the door that doesn't go through a UAT process. That includes security releases from Drupal. It certainly doesn't necessarily get the same level of functional testing that some of the other tickets get, but it certainly gets some level of UAT. We've built this into our timetables. So I think that even a small change that goes out goes through this cycle, so there's an understanding that there's not ever just taking a piece of code and pushing it out the system. If we have to get it out that day, we never shortcut the UAT steps. We always go through that cycle. So I mentioned earlier that to start off, if you're not doing something like this, a way to be successful at it is to keep it as simple as possible. Don't put in fancy documentation systems. You don't need fancy tools to do this stuff. All you really need is a documented process that you can use internally. We use Jira for our ticket management system. So when you look at a ticket, any ticket, if you go back through the, 1,500 tickets that are in there since I've been involved, what you'll see is every ticket you open, you'll see that there's the business requirements for this functionality. You'll see a technical approach the developer took summarized. Then you'll see deployment steps to put them out, all in one ticket here. Nothing fancy. And then you'll see user acceptance testing. You'll see all the test scripts right inside the Jira ticket. It's really straightforward. And it looks like this. That is a screenshot of a ticket, of the inside ATF ticket here. This is a sample of those steps that I saw earlier and how they look in the Jira ticket. And you'll notice there's these green check marks there. So part of our deployment process says when it's time to deploy, one of the steps in the deployment steps is, hey, look at the ticket and verify that everything is green. If everything's not green in that UAT, that ticket doesn't go out. Someone says, hey, to comment in the ticket, this isn't, all these check marks aren't checked. So there's something up here. And it's most of the time it's the person who did the UAT just forgot to tick them off. Sometimes something actually didn't get tested. So it's an indication of that. And how do you do that in Jira? Oh, it's so simple. It's you just go into their markup mode and you put 2 little brackets, open brackets, and when you put a slash in it, it turns it into a check mark. Simple approach. So, I said a few minutes ago that the best way to get to automated testing is to do user acceptance testing. I'm going to talk about BHAT a little bit now and how this process, if you put something like this in place as part of your cycle and you become a testing culture, implementing something like BHAT is a lot simpler than coming at this without doing any testing whatsoever. And you'll see why now. So, BHAT is a PHP framework for auto testing your business expectations. I like to actually change the title of BHAT to say what it really should be is a framework for automating your user acceptance testing. And if you think of it like that, this whole presentation makes more sense to you. So, has anyone used BHAT? Okay, so BHAT works with a language called Gherkin, and it's a very English language, like you can just sort of describe what you're trying to test. And what happens is that description of what you're trying to do is translated into PHP code. So someone writing the test scripts uses everyday language, and then when it runs, it executes this specific code. There was a good presentation earlier today. If you didn't see it, you could go back and watch the video. It was on doing this kind of Gherkin language with Python. So it's not using BHAT and PHP, but using Python, but exactly the same thing. They gave a lot of good examples in there on how they implemented some Python with Gherkin. So here's an example of what some Gherkin code looks like. You have a scenario that you're trying to test, and it says like here, given there is a Sith Lord lightsaber which costs this, when I do this and this thing should happen. So we're going to talk a little bit about how BHAT is implemented. When I first started playing with BHAT a number of years ago, I was confused for a while at what exactly it was doing, what the layers are. So I'm just going to talk a little bit there, not get too techy, but give you enough to get started. So when you're doing user acceptance testing, that smiley face on the left-hand side is your happy UAT person. And what they do is they interface with the web browser and talk to your Drupal application. What BHAT is replacing that smiley face with a piece of software. So it's still interfacing with the browser and testing your application. BHAT works in two kinds of ways. Headless emulation with a browser, or something they call browser controller. So the difference between those two things, do I put them here? No, let me describe it a little more here. The difference there is when you're using headless, you can't do any front-end testing of JavaScript and stuff like that. So when you're using the headless emulator with BHAT, you're testing browser functionality, clicking and entering things and pushing buttons. You can't test any front-end kind of logic that way. If you're using browser controller, that's when you'll see BHAT actually pop the browser up on the screen and you see it automatically running and the thing's getting clicked. It's actually using the browser itself to do the testing. And now you have full access to everything that's going on in the browser. When you start to look at BHAT, you'll see something called Mink. Mink is an API that is part of BHAT. It's the interface between the Gherkin language that you're writing and either one of those two interfaces. So you can write the same kind of Gherkin language and have it work with either the headless browser or the browser controller. So it's an interface library. So let's talk about BHAT and Drupal a little bit. Drupal has a module called Drupal extension. Why it's called that, I have no idea. But what that does is it interfaces with BHAT and gives you access to Drupal-y things. So without this, you're just kind of interfacing with the browser directly. So anything you can do in a browser, you can just do. This extension here gives you access to more Drupal stuff. And what kind of stuff can you do when you have this installed? It works in three ways with three kinds of libraries. One of the first library is called Blackbox. Blackbox is an interface that basically provides you one piece of functionality, and that's mapping regions. So when you're writing your scripts, you can set up this mapping that says this CSS tag or this ID tag that's sitting in the footer, it might not be called footer, but I want to reference in my Gherkin language, I want to say, look in the footer, and it will map that to a certain region within your web page. That's what Blackbox provides you. There's a Drush API as well. What Drush does, it gives you access to create users, and that's it. I thought create nodes. No, it's not. Just create users. The advantage of using Drush and Blackbox is you can run tests on a server that you're not connected to. So a remote server you can run these tests against. If you go as far as using the Drupal API, you now have like full access to Drupal to do all kinds of things. I think I got some scripts here. When you use the Drupal API, you can use language. Your language that you have access to in Gherkin extends to things like this. You can ask questions like, am I logged in? Or log me in with a certain role. So it knows about Drupal. So things you can do with the Drupal API, adding nodes, updating nodes, deleting nodes, you can do when you use the Drupal API version of that module. The downside to it is it only works on the machine that you're connected to. So the Behat script actually has to run on the same machine that the server's on, which isn't necessarily a problem if you're doing this in a continuous integration environment. You're spinning up something and that test is probably running on the same machine anyway. But at the end of the day, you're not really picking any one of those solutions because you can use them all. You can do browser testing. You can use the Drupal API to do Drupal-y kind of things. You have access to a full breadth of this kind of stuff to do any kind of testing you need. So if we were to take a look, if you think of those scripts I mentioned earlier, the UAT scripts, and you kind of think about this Gherkin stuff that we've mentioned in the last few minutes, this is how those tests look in the Gherkin language in Behat. The same test that we ran earlier. So you can see the feature that we're testing is inside ATF. The first scenario is to verify the private file is not available. So given I'm on this document, I should see access denied. So this is doing the same kind of testing that I had my users do earlier. So when you start to think about automating your testing, the question is what should you test? What things should you automate? And does this replace user acceptance testing? So there's useful things. The things that you should automate are the things, one, that are critical, right? So write Behat tests for the things that are critical for your website to be running. So an example like that is the front page up. Another example could be this inside ATF that we were discussing today. I'm not sure that automating all of those steps all the time makes sense, but certainly validating that the public can't get to the PDF file would be a test that would make sense. I would call that critical and should be run all the time. Can someone access a PDF that they're not supposed to from the public? Maybe you would also want to add into the regular test to validate the username and password is working and not broken in some way. So those could be two tests that you'd add in all the time. So you want to be looking at repetitive things too, things that you'd be repetitively testing. But it's really important to understand that automation doesn't replace the domain knowledge, the perspective, and the intuition, and all the value that we get from those manual tests that I described earlier during that cycle. You can't skip that manual UAT test and just jump to Behat. What you could do is you could take some of those Behat tests that are sitting in your library of things that you know how to test and move those into Behat to do some automation. So some tips on how to get started with Behat. My recommendation is to go to Behat and there's a fantastic tutorial there. Has nothing to do with Drupal. It just takes you through installing Behat on your machine. You can test any website with it. Once you install it, you can test anything. Foxnews.com, things on your local machine, anything that your browser has access to, you can test it. And the nice thing about this tutorial is it doesn't have the Gherkin language built in right away. So it teaches you how to write PHP to actually implement your own language. So if you go far with Behat, you're going to find at some point there's going to be things in your system that you could write your own custom language for that's meaningful to your website and is very useful. You learn how to do that in this tutorial. My next step would be to install the Drupal Behat extension. That runs outside of Drupal as well. It's not really connected to Drupal in any way. You can just run it in by itself. It just understands Drupal. It doesn't have to be in a Drupal website. And I would start to do local building and testing with the API. Like I said earlier, this is a slow process to get up and running. I think once you have a manual process in place, you can slowly build in the Behat. And just like I mentioned earlier in this presentation about setting attendance goals, not performance goals, we have that struggle at the ATF too. We've got a really fantastic user acceptance process. You see that today. Our Behat is way behind that. We have some automated things. There's way more room we can do in there. But what we do is we can build those in over time. One of the problems with automated testing is you're always trying to get work done, and it's never enough time scheduled to write automated tests, right? I think our challenge at the ATF has been that, is to we have some scripts written, but how do we now grow that library in a great way? Well, it's hard to have someone put a project, hey, spend the next month getting those scripts set up. So I don't have any magic solutions for you there, other than the great advice of set attendance goals, not performance goals. The other thing I would recommend too is if you're not using any build frameworks that have this kind of support in it for Behat, you should check them out. Like Acquia BLT framework has stuff already built in to execute Behat scripts if you have them. And you can even look at how BLT works to see how you could integrate that stuff into your processes. It's a great way to get some information. And last point we'll make here, yeah. Plan your one-time developer and CI scripts separately. So if you think about your workflow of your project, you could have Behat scripts that you only want your developers to have access to and run. They might run them once a month, they might run them when they feel like it, or when they want to test a certain area of the business. I wouldn't take every script you ever have and run it every single time. It doesn't make sense. So you might have developer-only scripts, you might have one-time scripts, and then you might have scripts that you just want to run in your CI process. So in summary, implement a good UAT process. Set those attendance goals. Work on that culture of testing. That will enable you to do these things and have them scheduled into your life cycles and into your timetables. Implement automation responsibly, meaning don't throw everything into your automation process. Think through it. And reevaluate every 6 months. Put something in the calendar that says, hey, let's revisit where we are with automation in 6 months and see if you've gained 15 more pounds during that time or you've taken 15 pounds off. And then once you have this process in place, then you can set some performance goals for yourself. And that's it for me. So thank you for coming today and hope you enjoyed your week. Are there any questions? Any thoughts? Other than, let's go home. And I appreciate that too, because I'm looking forward to going home. Yes?
Where in New England are you from?
I'm from Rhode Island.
Grew up in Boston.
Ah, okay. New England, do you go to New England Drupal Camp?
I did it.
Okay, we'll have you there this year.
When is it?
November 23rd. It's a Friday of training, and then Saturday is sessions. All right, thank you very much. Yeah, go ahead. No question.